all of these societies are going to confront real crises of how to replenish their workforces and their leadership cadres so that without, again, some significant integration, one could say the vitality of these societies is really at risk because the mainstream populations which have provided this sort of leadership are shrinking. Okay, so I want to expand a bit upon the challenges by using some work to which Maurice has been a contributor that looks at educational differences between low-status immigrant children and native children. But then I'm going to move into a more hopeful vein and to say that we can see in the American experience a configuration of elements that could happen in the near future that really gives us hope for the possibility of change. So first the dismal news, then the potentially good news. Okay, so first of all I want to argue that when we think about educational outcomes, many of us of course have been influenced by the regular reports of the PISA and other studies, and these are useful, but they only tell us about one of the two critical dimensions. And the dimension they tell us about is school-taught skills, certainly important. Nevertheless, there's good reason to think that when we deal with immigrant populations, that they may take a long time to catch up in terms of school-taught skills. They're coming from families that have a variety of disadvantages for them, parents with little education who cannot help them in school, family situations where they may speak in a non-mainstream language. It is, we shouldn't expect them right away to perform on the level of native children in schools. So therefore, a second dimension is important. It's important to pay attention to the credentials that young people earn in school. And there's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship at the individual level between skills at the age of 15, which is when they are tested by PISA, and the eventual credentials that young people earn. We want to see how both turn out. So I'm going to use some of the results from a large study funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation to look at the children of immigrants in schools in the United States and 5 Western European countries, one of which was, well, it was really Amsterdam that we used, but that was taken as representative of the Netherlands. And, the basic story here is that even though in these 6 countries there were very different school systems, the United States has a kind of a comprehensive system until the end of high school where there isn't much formal tracking, where children can in fact move among tracks which are within the same high school building, for instance, compared to the Netherlands, which is a softer version, one might say, of the German system, where you have tracking that starts at a relatively early age, and I gather it is increasingly leads to children being separated in separate school buildings. But despite this diversity of school system arrangements, there's a fairly consistent pattern of roughly the same order of magnitude of difference between the attainments, whether they are skills or credentials, of the children from low-status immigrant families and the children coming from native families. This final note, by the way, is for my American colleagues, because they too often think that in the United States we know how to do this, we've been successful, where's the problem, they're all going to do well in the end, and it's simply not true. And in fact, the United States comes out on the lower end of the scale when we look at these differences. So if we look at the PISA reading scores, for example, to make the comparison consistent here, I've taken the native-born, that is to say receiving society-born, children of immigrants, where the immigrants have less than the final secondary school credential, and I'm comparing them to the children who've grown up in native families, where the parents, in other words, are born in the receiving society and the children are born in the receiving society. And you'll notice that there are pretty sizable gaps. There are some differences. Germany shows up particularly badly in the PISA scores. And again, I think this is often taken as evidence for a conclusion that I believe, which is that a system where children are tracked after the 4th grade creates big disadvantages for immigrant origin children. The Netherlands comes out fairly well in terms of the school-taught skills of immigrant origin children. Nevertheless, there are really sizable differences across the board. When we look at credentials, with one exception, the story is very similar. Look in the final column, the right-hand column, the university degree. What did I do here? Oh my God. Thank you. Let me see here. How did I get ahead of myself? You guys didn't say anything. Was the last slide also out of?
Yes.
Okay, well, please be more vocal if I get it. It's hard to see what's on the screen here. Okay, so look in the right-hand column, the university degree column, and in the Netherlands, for example, these are the data from the Thai study. You can see that the gap between the native Dutch and the second generation Moroccans is very large. These were people in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, so they're in cities with universities. Hence, the overall level of university achievement is very high. In the United States, where this is a national data set from the census, if we compare non-Hispanic whites and US-born Mexicans, who are primarily of the second generation, you can see that the differences are on the order of 2 to 1 and 3 to 1. They are actually growing somewhat larger over time, even though college attainment is going up for all groups, but it is going up more rapidly in the native white population than it is in minority populations. The one exception is the UK. And all the data seem consistent that in a very recent period, that the children of Pakistanis and Bangladeshis thought to represent sort of the bottom tier of the immigrant population in the UK has in fact caught up. And I don't think that we have an entirely satisfactory explanation for that. My own guess is that it's a combination of things that are true of the immigrant groups themselves, their community resources, for example, but also of the native British population, which is still very class-bound, and where working-class white Brits are very unlikely to go to university. So, in any event, that's an interesting finding that remains to be explained. So, sociologists who study educational systems would say, well, there's nothing surprising in this. We know all this, or we should expect all this, because, and here I think is a limitation of the sort of standard explanatory mode used by many of my sociological colleagues, with exceptions in this room. But the problematic that is taken typically as requiring explanation is the reproduction of inequality from one generation to the next. So the theories then are useful when we want to explain the reproduction of inequality. The theories of maximally and effectively maintained inequality, incidentally, suggest or claim that changes in the overall distribution of education, for example, expansion in the higher tiers of education, do not really lead to diminishment of inequalities in education, because in various ways the already advantaged group is positioned to take even more advantage of the changes than are the less advantaged groups. True enough, but what we really need now is we know that there's going to be profound demographic changes facing all of these countries. So we need a better understanding of the set of circumstances under which we might actually see changes in the extent of inequality between immigrant groups on the one hand and the native population on the other. So that's what I'd like to explore with you now by using an example taken from American history as an instructive one. So change here, I'm interested in changes in the order of the magnitude of inequality. So we're not simply talking about the fact that some individuals from minority backgrounds are able to succeed. We accept, of course, that's true in all of these systems. It's really what we're interested is in change in some sense in the kind of the nature of the social boundary between the majority population and the immigrant minority population, or change in some sense in the sort of structure of opportunities between these populations. What I'm going to argue is that the American case of the past suggests that one of the key factors is going to be what I'll call non-zero sum mobility. That means mobility for a minority group that is not necessarily perceived as threatening to the position of an established population. So I'm assuming that most of the time the established population is very intent on guarding its privileges and will act in ways that tend to thwart an expansion of opportunities for a disadvantaged minority. So educational systems then preserve inequalities because as they change, the advantaged majority finds new ways to reconstruct privileges for its children. So we have to ask, well, when might this not come into play? And I'll argue that the baby boom's departure is important here, but first let's go to the American case and look at a really unusual setting. So in the middle of the 20th century, in the United States, the mainstream of society was not simply white, as it is seen today. It was white Christian, where Christian had a specific meaning. It referred to whites coming from Protestant backgrounds, not from Roman Catholic backgrounds. So it was not, there of course was a major division between whites and non-whites, particularly whites and blacks, but within the white population there was a very pronounced social division, visible in many ways, between whites of different religious and ethnic backgrounds. And there are many indicators for how important this division was. Probably not too many Europeans know that the Ku Klux Klan is spoken of as having two lives. So one life was after emancipation, when it was a force to oppress freed African Americans in the South. The other life was in northern cities in the 1920s, when the target was less African Americans than it was new immigrants. And it was part of a mobilization to change the laws of immigration in order to restrict the arrival of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And this, in fact, was accomplished in 1924, 1921 and 1924. The laws were changed in the United States to impose a national origin system of immigration, which was biased against Europeans of some backgrounds, Europeans coming from Italy, Russia, etc. In 1928, there was an election in which the first Catholic candidate, Al Smith, was sponsored by a major party, by the Democrats, ran for president. and was soundly defeated by Herbert Hoover. And at that